Yeah, and I want to nuance your statement because there's a lot of, to me, one of the frustrating things is the use of Israel, Palestine,
phrases. You mean
all these phrases, right? It's and I'm nuanced because I want to keep things kind of really, really particular. So we talk about Israel as a nation, and I want to really focus in on Israelis. Because Israel is a nation state, and we're not talking about Israel like in the Bible. And as Christians, we can get that mixed up. Like, we can talk about somebody being saved, and we're like, oh, they were saved? Yeah, from a fire. It's like we can still use those terms, but it doesn't mean they're been saved by Jesus. And the same thing, we can call people of Israel, they're Israelis. They're not Israelites. They're not Hebrews. They're not all Israelis are Jewish. Right?
Some of them are Arabic. Some of them are Christian.
Some of them are Bedouin.
Sammy Davis Jr.
Some of them are
was Jewish.
Some of them are not ethnically Jewish.
Right. And so the point there is to not to conflate Israeli with Jewish. There are Jewish people, and then there are Israelis, and that's a Venn diagram. And I know we don't like Venn diagram. I'm just kidding. We love them. But what happens? And then you have Hamas, and then you have Arab Palestinians, you have Christian Palestinians, you have Muslim Palestinians. And so there is a Palestinian was actually a new term coined really in the 1960s. They were 70s, Arabs. They were just the Arab
refugees
people,
from the war.
Yeah. So when you end up with this, you have to get this context right, because I want to make sure that when we talk about the peoples, we're talking about I don't want to try to use the word Israel as much, because I think that does get confusing for Christians. That we're like, oh, we need to support Israel because they're the people of the Bible. And I want to go time out. No, they're Israelis. And some of them are atheists, like you said. Some of them are Christians. Some of them are Buddhist. You can worship whatever you want there.
Some of them are 20% of the nation, I think, is Arabic.
Ethnically, yeah.
Ethnically.
And so we want to remember that when we're looking in your Bible, that we can't equate modern terminology into ancient terminology. And that's a critical piece for me. Now, I do believe, however, historically speaking, that this idea of Hamas wanting to push the Israelis and push the Jews out, they would let anybody who's an Israeli who's not Jewish stay probably, but they want to get rid of all the Jewish people because it's a anti-Semitic group. And so what I see is really that they are the ones who are just trying to kill off a whole bunch of people because they think it's their land. They really still continue to believe that these people stole. And the reason why you get this conversation about colonization and all these things is because of the history. And so we want to remember, and I'll just quickly walk through the history of the land, just because kind of Jacob asked for it. And I think it helps kind of put things in context. So you start off with the history of the land. You start off where originally the land's Canaanite. Right, Abraham is told, go wander through the land, and it's Canaanite. Canaanites were
different nations, tribes, mostly.
So different tribes of different types, but they were unified under a Canaanite, a Hittite empire. But there was other forms. You had Sodom and Gomorrah, and you had these other little tribes. You had city states. You didn't have nation states like we do today. So Israel comes in after the Exodus and receives the land. God kicks them out, destroys the Canaanites. Israel becomes the people, and they start what they like to call the first commonwealth under David. It was a monarchy, commonwealth. It was kind of an interesting setup because you had all the tribes, but they had a king, and the king deferred to the tribes, and the tribes deferred to the king, and yet God was king. So there's a very complex political relationship in this place of Israel, and it spans pretty far by the time of Solomon, to the north near the Euphrates, all the way down to in the edge of Sinai Peninsula. And so there's maps in your Bibles and stuff, you can see that. Now, that all falls apart in the imperial time period because eventually that kingdom breaks in two, and the northern kingdoms are taken over by Assyria, and the southern kingdoms will be taken over by what conquers Assyria, called Babylon. And then Babylon will fall to the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire will fall to the Greek Empire. During the Greek Empire, after Alexander the Great builds it out, it's going to divide into 4 groups, and two of them the northern and the southern kings are going to become the ones who dominate, and Israel's going to flop back and forth until finally this group of people called the Maccabeans rise up, which you can read in the book of Maccabees and different stuff, and they throw off the Greek rule, and they become what they call the Hasmonean dynasty and the Maccabean period. And so this is the second Commonwealth, the second time Israel is allowed to rule themselves since David and since the kings. That only lasts until Rome shows up and just says, you're ours. And they're like, okay. They can't really fight Rome. They don't have the power for it. Rome kind of just seeds them in, but gives them all kinds of like benefits, but they're not independent. In fact, eventually, you're now in Jesus' time period. You know, there's all kinds of corruption from the Herods, and then you've got Pontius Pilate, and the Romans are trying to keep these Jewish people at bay.
And at this time, it's called Judea.
Yeah, there's Judea and Samaria, and then in the north, there's Galilee. And so these are the areas. Now, those areas eventually fight against Rome. They try to kick out Rome in 70 AD, called the Jewish Revolt or the Jewish Revolution, and they fail. Titus comes in, destroys them, takes out the entire temple, and boom, there's no temple. All that goes away. And they kind of are existing. They're kind of figuring themselves out until the Bar Kokhba Revolt, where this man, Jacob Bar Kokhba, stands up. He claims he's the Messiah, tries to start this revolt, and Hadrian just wipes him off, and then kicks all the Jews out, renames Jerusalem Anatolia Capitolina, and then slowly he allows Jews back in. But now they are a subjugated people. They are spread out everywhere. They're living in their area, but they don't have any rule, any rights to it. Now, that pretty much continues until Rome becomes broken into two, into the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire, the European Christendom. And so in Byzantine time periods, this is a territory owned by Constantinople. It wasn't Istanbul yet. It was Constantinople. And so it becomes Istanbul. After the Islamic empires come in, they take over the territory. Still not owned by anybody. It's just a territory in a giant empire. And this happens roughly in six.
The Jews are still there. They're still living there. Even after the 70 AD, they're kicked out. To slam the Jews, the Roman Empire calls it Palestine, which is named after the Philistines because they knew that would offend the Jews because that was their old enemy that had been wiped out by them. So the name Palestine comes from the Romans, and that's important to remember because a lot of people will say in this current situation that like, oh, well, Palestinians have always been there. And I'd say, no, that phrase, that term, that group of people was not there from the beginning. It was different people groups that were there. And Israel was always one of them. They lived in the region. Even when they kicked out, they tried to go back.
So all that to be said, Islamic rule takes over in 637. They're kicked out by the Crusaders. The Crusaders rule till 1187 when the Saladin comes in and wins back Jerusalem. And you start two other big, gigantic empires. The Mamluk is the last one until the Ottomans take over. The Ottoman Empire then lasts till 1948 because they lost. They united with, in World War I, they united with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and
picked the
Germany.
wrong side.
And they lost. And all that land became owned by the English, the British,
and the French.
The U.S. said, yeah, have it. We didn't want to deal with it.
This is World War I.
Yeah, and so World War II kicks off, and they stay fairly neutral, actually. The North Africa does not. North Africa joins the Axis powers. But that territory of the Ottoman Empire is no longer Ottoman. It's controlled by the British, the French, and it's called Palestine too, and it's all these kinds of things. Well,
they kept the name from the Romans.
And that stays there until the British finally end World War II, and after the atrocities that happened to the Jewish people, there's this movement called Zionism, which was a movement that began in kind of the English and the European churches of a back to Jerusalem kind of movement. Like they wanted the Jewish people to have a home, and they said, well, let's give them their ancestral home back. And so they a big call. A lot of Jews moved in. There were a lot of Jews who already lived there.
They already lived there, and to also remember in that history, it was the only place that they, since way back before Canaan, but for the longest time that they declared this as Israel's place because it was Jerusalem, and Jews lived there longer than anyone in history. It was their homeland. It was their indigenous homeland for many years.
And originally the UN offered a two-state solution. They were going to give two different areas, one for the Jewish people, which was smaller in 1948, and one for the Arabs. And the Arabs rejected it. They didn't want it. They didn't want anybody to be there but Arabs. And so they The day that they declared that Israel was a nation, all of the Arabic nations around them attacked. And so this starts a series of wars where Israel gains land and then keeps giving it back for hope for peace. And so this keeps happening until recently, this latest one. And they're not in Gaza. They don't own Gaza. Gaza is an occupied territory they won in one of the wars. I don't remember which one it is, but at this offhand.
I think in the 70s is when it happened. But remember, what happened was these Arab nations were kind of formed after World War I and II. In World War II, the Arab nations that surrounded that area, they allied with the Axis parties and the Nazi party. And so they didn't like the fact that the Allies had created a nation state of Israel. And so they did attack, and they got summarily wiped out pretty bad, and that meant that now Israel is in charge of land that they didn't have before because it belonged to their enemy, and so they tried to give it back for peace, and then there's been fighting on either. At first, some of them didn't want it because they still consider this war. They still have. There's several nations. There's like 23 in the surrounding area. I think 22, 23. Most of them, a large percentage of them, still haven't recognized Israel as a nation, even though they've been there for over 70 years. So. Keep that in mind because I think it's important to think that we think that the hostilities between Arab and Jews, though they are religious and historic, a large percentage of the anti-Semitic stuff came in as a result of the tail end of World War II, borrowing from Nazism, and still to this day is used in a lot of propaganda.
So I'm going to finish it up with just this thinking. So, and then we'll dive in, I think, next week into the actual, how does Israel fit into eschatology and end times? Because that's a very complicated, thorny conversation. But I do want to say that the reason the reason that we would stand in support of Israel, number one, is because first and foremost, they are a democratic, free society. The gospel can go freely through that country, and that is a huge deal. Second, I am, again, separating Israelis and Jewish people. I am very supportive of Jewish people. They've been killed off. I think that the spiritual
anti-Semitism.
That because of anti-Semitism, I don't think they're saved. But I want to care for them so deeply because I want them to know their Messiah that I worship. I worship a Jewish Messiah.
Yeah.
I worship the Jewish King. I worship the Jewish God. I'm planted in their tree. Why would I treat those people poorly? And that's the response that I have in the sense of my heart for Jewish people. It runs deep. My stance for Israel insofar as a nation state, as a Christian, I stand and I stand with them because they're our ally. I believe they have the Judeo-Christian ethic. They are a democracy in the area that, yes, it's the homeland of Jesus. I don't want that place destroyed either. And it'll be the eternal location of the kingdom of God's center. And that being said, though, I don't think that we don't stand back and rightly adjudicate evil for evil when evil is done. I'm not here to just be like, hey, they can do whatever they want. I don't think that's good either.
And we can criticize their policies. There's no blind allegiance to the state of Israel in so much as if it violates what I consider to be Judeo-Christian ethics, then I would also push back. And when they do that, I think there is criticism. But the reason why I think we ally with them is because of what they do and how they govern themselves. It's the same with most of our allies. We're really close to UK because of the fact that they share Judeo-Christian ethics with us. Same thing with Israel. They're a democracy that shares Judeo-Christian ethics with us. Insofar as they do those things, I'm in agreement with supporting them as allies. So
yeah, for me, that means that I support the nation, but I think that when I say I really support the Jewish people, in that sense, I'm talking globally at that point. They're more than just that place of Israel. And so I want to stand with Jewish people because they're all hurting together in this. Because this is the outside of the United States, I believe it's the most concentrated amount of Jewish people.
40%, only 0.2% of the world is Jewish. That's something to keep in mind because when they lose 2,000 people, that's a large number,
huge.
Especially since their countries maybe the size of New Jersey. And so they are really worried about extinction, and it has happened in their history several times. So I think that people need to understand the history is a very sensitive thing. That doesn't mean I don't have compassion for the percentage of people that are in Palestine that are suffering under this particular war. But war, I think, is something we remove ourselves from. We usually just blindly alliance ourselves with one group that's our allies, but we don't actually know the horrors of war. Same thing with Ukraine, same with things. There are things on that we need to call out, but war is awful, and I think we need to look at it, and it's never going to be clean, and there's never going to be perfect kind of warfare going on where only the innocent live and the guilty people die.